Stay tuned, we're gonna have a bunch more videos coming out, so keep your eyes out and have a good night.
Have a good day. I hope you're doing well.
The YT Izzo is a bit more on the lighter duty end of the trail bike spectrum than the other suspension bikes we have here in Tucson, Arizona. This bike, the Stumpy, and the Vazari all have 130 millimeters of travel out back, but this is the only one that's matched with 130 millimeter travel fork. It's also the only bike here with a carbon frame. It uses the same front triangle that you'd find on the $7,500 top level build, bolted to an aluminum rear end. The Izzo has numbers that could seem conservative for some, but are perfectly suited for cross-country-like quickness and marathon efficiency. I think that the Izzo will fare well here in Tucson's techie, punchy trails. Let's see what the testers think.
You guys have all heard the details of the bike now, so we're gonna talk with these two to see how it actually performs out on the trail. Palmer, I know you were saying this is the best climber out of the bunch. I'm curious to hear your reasons on that. Why do you feel that way?
Yeah, for me, I mean, this bike just felt more snappy. It had like better acceleration. It felt light and maneuverable. I was able to clean sections of the really technical trail on our test course. It was actually the only bike that I cleaned the entire trail on. It still has 130 millimeters of travel like some of the other test bikes here, but it's got a little bit more like speed and punch to it.
I'm with Palmer. I mean, this bike feels kind of like the way I would want a classic trail bike to feel. It's not your go smash as hard as you can on the descents and just kind of putter your way uphill. It has a nice, good acceleration, and it's, even though it has 130 millimeters of rear travel, it's well managed, so you still get kind of good suppleness off the top, but it's not wallowing up and down. Even with 25% sag, you were able to kind of find good traction, which is key here in the desert where there's just rocks and loose kitty litter, and you just want that wheel to track. So I was super impressed with how it climbed. Definitely my favorite climber out of the bunch. Should also say that in some cases it weighs 5 pounds less than some of the other bikes that we have. I mean, there's a price difference between those, but yeah, I mean, 30 pounds for a bike that's $32.99, that's pretty good for what you're getting.
It's really impressive.
Yeah, so now on the terrain thing, we've been testing on a variety of terrain, and we have some bikes here that perform really well in some areas, not so well in others. Do you guys feel like this bike has a specialty when it comes to climbing?
It's definitely the most sort of XC feeling of all the bikes here out of the full suspension bikes anyway. It's not the most traction-y of all the bikes, but it also, it combined to be the fastest for me for sure.
Mm-hmm. Kaz, for tech climbing, did you feel like it performed well as some of the others that might have more traction?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, I think I had the best tech climbing performance out of this bike. It does have a climb switch. You can move to a firm and an even firmer position. So if you want to get that little more sporty feel, the middle position can help for kind of smoother stuff. But then when it's really rough and nasty, you can open it all the way up and it tracks really well. And it's, I think the wheelbase isn't super long. You're not super stretched out. Like, we'll talk about the stem a little later. It does have a 60 mil stem, but overlooking that point, I think that it just kind of has that feel of a nice and compact. It helps it fit into those little tight corners and things where other bikes could get hung up.
Now, how about that seat tube? I see that it has a 77 degree seat tube when it's in the low position, 77.5 degrees when it's in the high position. Do you guys feel like that was appropriate for the bike?
Yeah, I thought it fit really well. I mean, like, the top tube length isn't too long. The reach is fairly moderate on this bike. It's like 472. And then the top tube length, correlated with that, isn't that long. So overall, the fit felt pretty good. It has a more compact feel. We do have, that's Canyon Spectral 125. That's kind of a longer wheelbase. Everything's longer on that bike. So this one has the more, bike that if you have a lot of tighter terrain, it's going to work better.
This is Mishka. Please subscribe to Beta so I can afford to feed her. She eats a lot, and right now the Beta membership is half off. It's only $24 a year. Even Mishka could afford that. Yeah.
All right, so moving on to descending. Once you're at the top of the climb, Casimir, how does it descend?
I was a big fan of how this felt. I mean, we do have to say that it definitely falls in the more lighter duty trail bike feel. Like you're not gonna go smash out as fast as possible just into everything and hope that it'll, suck it all up. But if you do take, a little smoother line or just kind of pick your line a little earlier, I was really impressed with what it can do. It likes to get off the ground, so and it's progressive enough that it lets you get away with some landings, decent little jumps and things. Good ramp up, and just a nice lively is the kind of term I kept coming back to. So it's you just want to hop and pop around. You can say playful too, another cliched word, but it does fit the way that this bike's manners are.
Yeah, Palmer, did the liveliness and playfulness work for you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I sort of would ditto everything that Mike said. Like it's just a bike that reminds me of sort of like the way that I grew up riding, with a little bit more XC flavor and riding a lot of technical stuff. But it really rewards like smooth, clean riding, and like when you can find a pocket and get nice flow on it, it really rewards you for that. It's a super, super fun bike to like get into that like flow vibe on.
So if you guys were gonna ride any trail on it, what type of trail is this bike for?
I mean, it's kind of like, I think the technical climb followed by a moderately technical descent, that's kind of perfect. Really around here, I think that this, out of all the bikes, we'll go into our roundtable discussion eventually, but this is my favorite for the terrain we were testing on, just because the trails are weird and chunky, and this bike let me get up the climbs really well, and then I could get down the descents just fine.
Yeah, and like, I mean, our test course was pretty chunky on purpose, but then when I ventured off the test course and found some like smoother, more XC undulaty terrain, this bike is the best on that as well, out of all of the bikes in the test group. Yeah, for here I think it's super well rounded, like because it does handle the techie stuff well. It does better on techie climbs. You might not be able to let it go so much on the really technical descents as much as some other bikes, but maybe even with a proper tire upgrade, you can hammer a little bit harder. And we'll get that later when we get into the parts.
All right, time to talk about how the components perform out on the trail. Palmer, anything that stood out to you?
For me, the biggest standout is the suspension on this bike. It just works. It's got Fox like performance level stuff, which works almost as well as the higher end stuff. And it's just like, that stands out really huge on these budget bikes, because the suspension, we're right on the cusp of like sort of really entry level stuff, and then this, which has a much higher like operating, it operates way, way better. And that was a big standout for me.
Yeah, totally. It seems like for a lot of these things, you get to a certain price point and you get 75%, 80% of the performance you get at the top end, and that might be hitting that price point. Does that seem accurate to you?
For sure.
What about you, Kaz? Any parts that stand out?
Yeah, for me, I totally agree with the suspension. We should talk about the tires a little bit. This bike has one of the more kind of cross-country oriented tires out of the other ones on test. It's got the Maxxis Forecaster, which is a fine tire. I get along with it. It's pretty drifty when we get some of the looser stuff. But I think if you wanted to get even a little more aggressive on this bike, if you swapped out the front tire, it'd be an easy way. We also did have some flats on the rear. It's so pointy here. I got a flat and was able to plug it, and then Palmer rode it later on. He had another flat, and he actually ended up sewing the case in the tire, which was pretty impressive. But just really more terrain dependent. I think they're an appropriate spec, and they can be really fun, and they do roll fast and they work well. But something you may need to tweak to suit your terrain. And then I guess the final spec note, probably it does have a SRAM NX drivetrain, which actually I thought felt better on this bike than some of the other ones, because they use the matchmaker clamp, and somehow it seemed like that made the shifting a little bit more precise. I don't know if that plasticky mount on the other ones affects it. But you do have the NX cassette, which means in the future, if you want to upgrade to something lighter, you're going to need to purchase a different free hub body. So just a little note.
But they do have a DT wheel spec, and DT free hub bodies are super common. Like lots of shops have these, and they have spares in stock and stuff. So like, out of all the options, it's actually, it does cost money, but there's parts availability to do so.
So how about the bad things?
For me, the 60 mil stem, just the handling of the stems there that long feels a little weird. If it was my personal bike, I'd probably drop down just to a 50 mil just to get my hand positioned where I want it. It's an easy swap. It's pretty common, but and I think in the past, YT has said they designed this bike around a 60 mil stem, but these days stems keep getting shorter and shorter. So I think you could toss that on to suit how you want. It would improve the downhill performance a little bit, just kind of getting you in that position. But I was able to ride around it, and it didn't really bother me as much as I expected it at first.
Do you think that the reach would still be long enough if you went down to a 50 for you?
I think it'd be close. It's definitely getting shorter. Like this bike isn't as long. It's a 472 reach, and then some of the other ones we have are 486. They're getting longer and longer. So this bike is kind of on the edge of being a little small, but I think that's kind of what gives it its character. So yeah, it's kind of an in-between. I don't want to dock them too hard for having that 60 mil stem, but I think just the position would be more what I'm used to with a 50, but it's, you know, especially if you're coming from an XC background, you're going to think that's just fine.
Okay, so we've heard about how the bike feels. Now it's time to get into some numbers. Casimir, you did the time testing. Tell us how it went.
Time testing, it was the fastest climber, which was totally expected. It feels the fastest out of the 5 bikes we have in the full suspension category. And then on the descents, it ended up being the 4th fastest. Again, it feels pretty quick, but you can't really just let it hang out like some of the other ones. It doesn't feel quite as, it's not a plowy kind of bike. And our descent trail was really rocky and chunky. So that's what happened there, but it ended up, yeah, so 1st for the climbs and 4th for the descents.
So since this is the Value Bike field test, we do have to talk about what you actually get on this bike for the money. Casimir, what do you think of the value?
Yeah, I think it offers a great value, and we talked about the carbon frame at this price point is impressive, and compared to some of the other bikes we have here, you know, the part spec and everything holds up super well. And even looking at YT's lineup, you know, you need to spend a decent amount more to start upgrading parts. So I think at this price point, it's a killer deal.
Moving on to pros and cons. We'll start with Palmer for the positives. What do you have to say that's good about the bike?
I just think like it was the fastest, kind of most fun, flavorful bike that I rode in the field test. It was like the most dynamic. It was the one that like encouraged me to pedal more. I just had like a really good fun time riding it on these XC sort of trails that are here. You know, in a different place that had, you know, that was more gravity oriented, I probably would have preferred, you know, the Spectral or something, right? But for what we were riding here, this was my favorite bike to play around on.
Now, Casimir, I know you like the bike, but I know you also like to be nitpicky. So let's hear it.
Yeah, this one's hard because there's really not a lot of major, you know, glaring cons. I'd say we complained about the shock. It doesn't take, the shock air valve is a little bit hard to access with certain shock pumps. So that's kind of more of an inconvenience than really a major flaw. It's really hard to find any more cons because for the price and the performance, this bike sets out and does exactly what it is meant to do. You know, you can ride it on good variety of terrain, suspension feels good, the parts are pretty good. So cons, I don't know, like it's not, I think we only just had the one little con on this one.
Con is it's hard to review.
Yeah, well, it's easy to review. It's just hard to really be mean to it. It's a very good bike for this price.
Who should consider buying this bike?
I think, yeah, anybody who's living in a place that's like not too gnarly. Like if I, you know, still lived in the Pacific Northwest, probably wouldn't be the bike for me. But yeah, people who are just out for like big, long rides, like huge loops in the Rocky Mountains kind of thing. That's probably this bike's bread and butter.
Yeah, I think it also works well as somebody that wants to do some cross-country style rides, but wants that little more travel. Like your traditional cross-country bike is gonna feel a little bit pointier, a little sharper handling. This bike is a little bit more relaxed, but still has that flavor. So it's kind of a nice sort of best of both worlds scenario in that you have a little extra travel to get you out of trouble, but not so much travel or so much weight that it just feels dull and uninspired if the terrain isn't quite as steep.
Yeah, it's like sort of for like a recovering XC racer kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I like that. Well, there you have it. That's the YT Izzo. Okay, what do I say here? Stay tuned for more field tests. We're gonna have reviews, we're gonna have the Huck to Flat, we're gonna have the Impossible Climb, and also probably a bonus video, so keep your eyes open. Not bad.
That was good.
That was actually pretty good.
Really?
Yeah, that was good.